On the morning of November 12, 1944, at exactly 8:50 in the morning, the air over the fjord. Captain Robert Twibber stood on the common bridge of the battleship Tirpitz, his eyes sweeping across the freezing waters. Beneath his boots rested 2,600 tons of the heaviest and most armored battleship in all Europe. As Weber prepared for a naval engagement, looking out from his armored citadel, he felt an intoxicating invincibility. According to every conventional rule of naval warfare written up to that point, he was absolutely right to feel so. No standard torpedo could ever hope to thread its way through the dense layers of anti-torpedo netting around the ship. No conventional armor-piercing bomb dropped from the low clouds could ever build up enough energy to crack her deck. Chemical smoke generators were positioned along the cliffs, capable of burying this steel behemoth in an opaque fog. However, Captain Weber was suffering from a fatal blind spot that would lead to a catastrophic end for his entire crew. He was still calculating his survival using traditional mathematics, unaware that the rules of war had been rewritten. He kept his binoculars trained on the horizon, anticipating a threat that would sail across the water toward his ship. What was coming for him was a manifestation of physics that completely ignored conventional naval tactics of the era. To the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the Tirpitz was never just an enemy ship, she was a true nightmare. Churchill was obsessed with sending this specific vessel to the bottom of the sea, bordering on the pathological. For 3 years, he bombarded the Admiralty with memorandums, hammering home the directive to destroy this great ship. Why would a battleship that almost never left its fortified harbor generate such an astronomical level of sheer panic? The answer lay in the strategic concept of the fleet in being, which kept the Royal Navy paralyzed in their own waters. Britain was forced to keep to modernized battleships and an aircraft carrier permanently chained to the home waters. They simply could not risk sending these heavy assets elsewhere, just in case the Tirpitz decided to run to the Atlantic. This strategic chokehold led the Royal Navy dry and meant every Allied convoy had to be guarded by a massive escort. It led to disastrous miscalculations where merchant ships were slaughtered in the ice and thousands of sailors died. The Tirpitz was winning the naval war without even bothering to fire her massive 15-inch guns at any Allied ship. To rip this thorn from the Allied effort, the British went to extreme lengths, enduring horrific casualties and failure. In September 1943, the British launched Operation Source, an exercise in deep-sea claustrophobia. The British engineered Dex craft, which were miniature submarines scarcely 50 feet long and 5 feet in diameter. They were essentially steel coffins where 4 men were rammed into a space so tight they could not even stand up. For days they endured the stench of fuel and sweat, surviving on a primitive air system that barely kept them alive. Towed for 1,000 miles across the North Sea, they eventually detached to face the deadly minefields all alone. Their objective was to cut through steel netting and lay 2 tons of explosives directly beneath the keel of the ship. Intelligence officers gave the mission a low chance of success and survival odds were practically non-existent for them. Out of 6 craft that set out, only 3 managed to navigate the deadly maze to reach the target, Battleship Tirpitz. They miraculously succeeded in detonating their charges, which severely buckled the massive structure of the vessel. But the ship was a marvel of engineering, featuring a double-bottom hull that absorbed the worst of the massive blow. She was wounded badly, but she stubbornly refused to sink, remaining a threat to the Allied forces in the cold north. In April 1944, the Royal Navy tried again with Operation Tungsten, unleashing a carrier-based airstrike. 40 Ferry Barracuda dive bombers roared into the fjord at dawn, catching the German gunners completely asleep. It was a perfectly executed vertical assault where 15 heavy bombs slammed directly into the deck of the battleship. The explosions ripped the superstructure and turned the upper decks into a slaughterhouse, killing over 100 men. It looked like a total victory, but when the reconnaissance photos made it back to London, their blood ran cold again. The Tirpitz was still floating perfectly level and had not developed even a single degree of list after the attack. With conventional weaponry and tactics thoroughly bankrupt, the British turned to an eccentric engine named Barnes Wallis. Wallis did not see Tirpitz as a ship to be sunk. He saw her as a pure and unadulterated physics problem waiting to be solved. His logic was simple: if we cannot pierce her armor from above, then we must completely annihilate the world beneath her. Unlike air, water and soil are fundamentally incompressible, meaning shockwaves travel much more efficiently through them. An explosion deep in Earth would be exponentially more destructive than any blast occurring in the open air. He called this the underground cavity effect, where an explosion creates a massive and instantaneous vacuum bubble. When the bubble collapses, it sucks the foundations out from under the target, causing massive structures to fall in. To weaponize this theory, Wallis designed a monster known as the Tallboy, a terrifying 21-foot earthquake bomb. Weighing a staggering 12,000 pounds, it contained nearly 6 tons of sheer destruction within its steel shell. While standard casings would crumple on impact, the Tallboy was cast from a single piece of high-tensile monolithic steel. It was machined with the agonizing precision of a naval artillery barrel to survive the massive shock of high-speed impact. Inside this casing went 5,000 pounds of torpedoes, an explosive 50% more powerful than the standard TNT. Factory workers poured the molten or PEX in slow layers, letting it cure perfectly over several weeks to avoid defects. The true genius of the Tallboy lay in its aerodynamics, with tail fins precisely angled at 5 degrees to force a spin. When dropped from 18,000 feet, this offset made the bomb spin like a bullet fired from a rifled gun barrel. By the time it reached the ground, it was traveling faster than sound, guided by extreme gyroscopic stability. This was a man-made seismic event. No naval aircraft could lift it, so the task fell to the elite Royal Air Force. The famous 617th Dambuster Squadron was chosen to deliver this gargantuan and devastating weapon. The modified Avro Lancaster bombers had to be brutally stripped down just to get the massive weapon off the runway. They ripped out heavy armor plating and defensive machine gun turrets, reducing the aircraft to flying fuel tanks. These majestic aircraft carried a single spear. In September 1944, they launched Operation Paralyzed. Lancasters launched from an austere base in Yagod-Nik, deep within the Soviet Union, to reach the remote fjord target. Flying through terrible weather, they dropped the Tallboys. Most missed in the smoke, but one bomb struck the bow. It penetrated deep before exploding. The apocalyptic shockwave shattered the hull, flooding engine compartments. The damage permanently crippled her ability to sail the open ocean, turning the giant into a paralyzed leviathan. Faced with a paralyzed ship, the German Heikom and made a gamble and towed the battleship south to Tromsø Fjord. They intended to use her massive artillery as a static floating fortress to repel any Allied amphibious invasion. Knowing she was taking on water, engineers spent weeks dumping sand and rubble onto the seabed beneath her hull. This artificial sandbank meant that even if the ship were blown open, she would only settle a few feet onto the sand. Her massive 15-inch guns would remain above the water. The German command declared her physically unsinkable. On November 12, 1944, 32 Lancaster bombers roared into the dawn sky from Scotland. Navigating the freezing route toward Tromsø, radar operators caught the blips of the incoming heavy formation. Air raid sirens echoed off the rocks while crews frantically cranked smoke generators, praying for the white fog. But the Arctic weather betrayed them. There was zero wind and the smoke pooled sluggishly on the water surface. The smoke failed to rise and conceal the towering superstructure, leaving the battleship exposed to the bombers. A catastrophic breakdown in German communications meant the Luftwaffe fighters received the warning far too late. Not a single Messerschmitt fighter took to the sky to intercept the 30 heavily laden British bombers. From 20,000 feet, The freezing bombardiers peered through optics and saw the terrifying dark silhouette. Down below, the Tirpitz massive main battery elevated to its maximum angle, firing high, explosive shells into the air. They tried to create a wall of explosive turbulence, but the Lancasters held a straight and utterly terrifying line. Operation Catechism, 30 to strip down Lancaster bombers, heavy with death, roared into the dawn sky from Scotland in 1944. Just after 8 in the morning, German radar operators caught the ominous blips of the incoming heavy bomber formation. The chilling wail of air raid sirens echoed off the sheer rock faces of the fjord as the attack began. On the decks of the Tirpitz, crews frantically cranked the chemical smoke generators, praying for the familiar white fog. But on this specific morning, the Arctic weather betrayed them, and there was absolutely zero wind in the fjord. The heavy chemical smoke simply pooled sluggishly on the water's surface, failing to rise and conceal the superstructure. A catastrophic breakdown in German communications meant that the nearby Luftwaffe fighter squadrons received the warning too late. Not a single Messerschmitt fighter took to the sky. The British bombers entered their attack run unopposed. From 20,000 feet, the freezing bombardiers peered through optics and saw the terrifying silhouette of the beast. The Tirpitz massive main battery elevated to its maximum angle, firing 150-pound shells. The Lancasters did not flinch and held a straight and terrifying line, making zero evasive maneuvers against the flak. At 8:41 in the morning, the first Tallboy tore itself from the bomb bay, breaking the sound barrier. It did not strike the ship directly, but plunged deep into the artificial sandbank just off the port side. This exact miss triggered the most horrifying element of the physics equation, known as soil liquefaction. The subterranean detonation unleashed a localized earthquake of unimaginable violence beneath the battleship. The seismic energy caused a catastrophic phenomenon where the solid sandbank turned into soupy quicksand. The foundation simply vanished, and the battleship immediately lost her stabilizing base against the elements. And then the killing blows landed as more Tallboy bombs struck with the kinetic energy of a falling meteorite. The Wotan-hardened steel offered no more resistance than wet cardboard against the supersonic spinning monoliths. The bombs punched effortlessly through the armored decks, plunging deep into the most vital organs of the ship. Over 12,000 pounds of highly volatile torpedoes exploded inside a sealed and heavily armored steel cavity. The apocalyptic internal pressure, finding no easy way to vent, simply tore the atomic structure of the ship apart. The Caesar turret, weighing 700 tons, was physically ripped from its barbette and thrown into the air. From the exact moment the first bomb ruptured the water to the final fatal rollover, it took a mere 11 minutes. Deprived of the sandbank and gutted by detonations, the hull began to roll rapidly to the port side. As the list hit 60 degrees, hundreds of tons of unsecured equipment broke loose and slid across the interior. At 8:52 in the morning, the Northern Queen of the Oceans surrendered, unrolled completely over. The massive superstructure plunged into the mud, leaving only the blood-red hull exposed to the Arctic sky. Over 970 German sailors died in those chaotic minutes as the ship turned into a tomb. For those trapped inside the overturned hull, the true agonizing horror was only just beginning in the dark. Let us plunge deep into the freezing and chaotic water, into the belly of the overturned steel tomb. When 52,000 tons of metal inverts, in 11 minutes gravity becomes a weapon of mass destruction. Floors violently became ceilings, while heavy generators and metal gear rained down, crushing hundreds of men. Those lucky enough to be in watertight compartments near the bottom found themselves in a black nightmare. The main generators had instantly failed, and the emergency lights flickered and died, leaving total darkness. Total absolute darkness enveloped them, a darkness so profound it felt heavy and suffocating on their skin. The freezing waters of the fjord hissed as it forced its way through shattered bulkheads, rising up their legs. The air rapidly grew thick and toxic, heavy with burned diesel and the metallic stench of blood and cordite. The men stood huddled together, on the inverted ceiling, breathing shallowly as oxygen levels plummeted down. Their only lifeline was to grab heavy wrenches and begin rhythmically hammering against the thick steel hull. They began rhythmically and desperately hammering against the thick steel hull, sending out more scode pleas into the abyss. Up on the surface, as the waters finally calmed and the useless smoke drifted away, the German crews were met with a chilling sight. The once mighty dreadnought was nothing but a massive and reed metallic island, silent against the backdrop of the Norwegian fjord. As they scrambled onto the slippery steel plates, the rescuers could feel the vibrations of the trapped men beneath their boots. Faintly, through inches of hardened armor, they heard the desperate and fading heartbeat of the men who were still trapped inside. The rescuers brought in heavy industrial acetylene torches, but the armor designed to protect the crew was now a prison wall. The woven steel was incredibly thick, specifically designed by naval architects to resist the melting heat and sharp cutting. The blue flames of the torches spat showers of sparks, but the progress was agonizingly and despairingly slow for the rescuers. Every millimeter cut through the metal took precious minutes that the men who were suffocating below simply did not have. Worse, the physics of the sinking ship added a deadly complication to the rescue effort that the engineers had to face. The air pockets keeping the men alive were highly pressurized by the massive weight of the water pushing in from below. The moment the cutting torch finally breached the hull, the pressurized air would violently scream out of the hole. If they were not careful, this sudden depressurization could cause the remaining air pockets to instantly collapse. They had to bleed the pressure slowly, fighting their own desperation to tear the hole open and save their comrades. When the first thin beam of a flashlight finally pierced the darkness of the breached hull, the sound was a ragged cheer. One by one, 87 oil-soaked and freezing German sailors were hauled up from the jaws of a metallic hell. It was a miraculous effort, but it was a small number considering nearly 1,000 men were still inside the ship. As the hours ticked by and the freezing tide rose, the rhythmic tapping from other parts of the ship began to slow. One by one, the pockets of tapping grew weaker until finally, the sounds of life stopped altogether in the fjord. By the end of the day, the massive red hull was completely silent, save for the wind howling down the fjord. Nearly 1,000 men were entombed forever in the steel fortress they had once believed was invincible. The annihilation of the Tirpitz sent shockwaves across the globe that reached far beyond the loss of a ship. In the bunkers of Berlin, it was the final and undeniable death knell for the surface fleet of the Third Reich. But in the war rooms of London, Winston Churchill wept tears of absolute relief since the psychological chokehold was broken. Within days, the Royal Navy unleashed its chained beasts as a massive armada sailed out of scope aflow for the Pacific. The deadly Arctic convoy routes to Russia were instantly made safer, saving countless mariners from a freezing grave. For the brilliant engineer Barnes Wallis, the overturned hull in Norway was the ultimate vindication of his theories. He had proven to the military traditionalists that brute force armor could always be defeated by applied physics. The Tallboy bomb did not just sink a ship. It permanently ended the era of the heavily armored dreadnought. It proved that no amount of steel could protect a target from a precision weapon using the kinetic energy of the planet. This concept laid the foundation for the deep penetrating bunker buster munitions that dominate modern military strategy. Yet, the story of the Tirpitz did not end with the echo of the final bomb on that cold morning in Norway. For years after the war, the massive steel corpse lay rotting in the fjord, a silent monument to a fallen empire. In the resource-starved years of post-war reconstruction, 50,000 tons of steel was a treasure too valuable to ignore. A joint Norwegian and German salvage company undertook an unprecedented and decade-long industrial autopsy. Using advanced underwater cutting gear, they slowly and methodically butchered the Leviathan for its valuable metal. The massive 15-inch guns of the Wotan armor plating were sliced up and fed into roaring blast furnaces. The ultimate machine of death was melted down and reborn as the infrastructure of a peaceful and modern Europe. Steel from the Tirpitz found its way into the drainage pipes of Oslo and into the tractor chassis in the fields of Norway. But perhaps the most profound and ironic legacy of this terrifying battleship lies entirely outside the realm of warfare. Because the Tirpitz was forged in the 1930s and sank before the detonation of the first atomic bombs at Trinity, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki, her steel remained completely uncontaminated. In the modern scientific and medical communities, this is known as low background steel, and it is an incredibly rare and almost priceless commodity today. Inside the shielding of Geiger counters, deep space radiation sensors, or life-saving medical imaging equipment, you will find the recycled armor of the Tirpitz. In an ultimate twist of irony, a monolithic engine of fascism and destruction was resurrected as an indispensable tool for the preservation of human life. When we look back at the dark waters of the Tromsø fjord, we see a story that transcends military history and the era of the battleship. It is a stark and brutal testament to the dangers of institutional hubris, a warning to those who believe armor can protect them. From the doomed sailors in the dark to the mathematical precision of the British, the destruction of the Tirpitz remains a terrifying demonstration of physics. The era of the battleship was not just defeated on that day. In Norway, it was violently and mathematically erased from existence forever. If you want to witness more moments where pure physics rewritten the history of war, don't forget to like and subscribe. I am your history and strategy observer, and I will see you on the next battlefield where science meets the storm of combat.